Imagine being in a position where every step you take could lead to exile, imprisonment, or worse. Yet, against all odds, you continue to push forward, driven by an unshakable sense of justice and compassion. This is the life of Shirin Ebadi, an Iranian lawyer, judge, and human rights activist, whose name has become synonymous with courage in the face of oppression. Her story is not just about her own triumphs, it's a universal tale of resilience, empathy, and the enduring fight for human rights. Born in 1947 in Hamadan, Iran, Ebadi grew up in a society deeply entrenched in patriarchal traditions. But even from a young age, she displayed an unwavering commitment to justice, which would go on to define her life's work. What is remarkable about Ebadi is not only her achievements, becoming the first Muslim woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize in 2003, but the way she consistently chose compassion and nonviolence as her guiding principles, even when faced with extreme personal danger. Doesn't that make you wonder, how does someone find such courage to keep going? Early life, foundations of a fighter. To understand Ebadi's resilience, we need to go back to her early years. Growing up in a middle-class family, Ebadi was taught the value of education and the importance of empathy from a young age. Her father, a professor of commercial law, encouraged her to pursue a career in law, even when societal norms suggested otherwise. Can you imagine how different her life might have been had she succumbed to the pressures of traditional gender roles in Iran? In 1969, Ebadi graduated from the University of Tehran with a law degree and quickly rose through the ranks, becoming one of the first female judges in Iran. At that time, it seemed like she had broken through the glass ceiling, setting a precedent for women in the legal profession. But this success was short-lived. After the Islamic Revolution of 1979, everything changed. Suddenly, Islamic law, Sharia, dominated the legal landscape, and Ebadi, along with all female judges, was demoted. The rationale? Women, it was argued, were too emotional to make legal decisions. Can you imagine the frustration, the sense of injustice, after working so hard to achieve something, only to have it taken away simply because of your gender? But rather than give in to despair, Ebadi used this setback as a catalyst for her activism. Her demotion didn't silence her, it ignited her passion for justice, legal struggles, standing up when it's hardest. After her demotion, Ebadi could have walked away from the legal field altogether. After all, her career as a judge, the pinnacle of the legal profession, had been unjustly stripped away. But Ebadi did the opposite. She opened her own law practice, focusing on defending those who couldn't defend themselves, women, children, and political dissidents. It's not difficult to imagine the personal danger she faced. Every case she took on was an act of defiance against the Iranian regime. She defended Mehdi Daibaj, a Christian pastor sentenced to death for apostasy, and Zara Kazemi, a Canadian-Iranian photojournalist who was beaten to death while in custody. These were not just legal battles, they were moral ones. And each case she fought chipped away at the oppressive systems that sought to silence her and her clients. One of her most famous legal battles involved the case of the serial murders of Iranian intellectuals in the late 1990s. In a society where the government itself was implicated in these murders, Ebadi's willingness to take on the case was nothing short of heroic. And yet, she never presented herself as a hero. In her mind, she was simply doing what was right. Isn't that incredible? So often, we look at figures like Ebadi and think they must possess something superhuman. But her story reminds us that the most extraordinary acts of courage often come from an ordinary sense of justice. The Nobel Peace Prize, a triumph for human rights. In 2003, when Shirin Ebadi was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, it was a moment of global recognition for a lifetime of work that had, until then, been largely fought in the shadows. Imagine receiving a phone call one day telling you that you've just become the first Muslim woman and the first Iranian to win the Nobel Peace Prize. How surreal must that moment have been? The Nobel Committee praised Ebadi for her efforts for democracy and human rights, focusing especially on her work for women, children, and refugees. But this was more than just a personal victory. It was a message to authoritarian regimes everywhere: justice, compassion, and human rights cannot be silenced. The Nobel Prize also brought international attention to the plight of the Iranian people, many of whom were, and still are, living under an oppressive regime. But while the world celebrated her, the Iranian government saw her as a threat. This is the irony of Ebadi's life: the more she achieved for human rights, the more dangerous her life became. Exile. The struggle continues. In 2009, as protests erupted across Iran following a disputed presidential election, the Iranian government turned its sights on Ebadi. Her office was raided, her colleagues were arrested, and her life was in constant danger. Finally, she was forced into exile. Can you imagine being driven from your home, your country, because of the very work that seeks to make it a better place? Even in exile, Ebadi's work didn't stop. She continued to speak out against the Iranian regime, advocating for human rights on the international stage. From her new base in London, she founded the Center for the Defense of Human Rights, providing legal support to dissidents and victims of human rights abuses in Iran. Ebadi has consistently maintained that nonviolent resistance is the only way forward. She often emphasizes that violence only begets more violence and that true, lasting change must be built on a foundation of compassion and justice. Isn't that such a profound statement in a world where violence so often seems like the only answer? Compassion as a guiding principle. If there's one word that defines Shirin Ebadi's life and work, it's compassion. Her legal battles were never about fame or financial gain, they were about standing up for the oppressed, for those who had no voice. Ebadi's compassion is not just an emotion, it's an action. It's a force that drives her to keep going, even when the odds seem insurmountable. Think about her philosophy for a moment. In a world that often feels consumed by hatred and division, Ebadi's commitment to compassion is incredibly powerful. It reminds us that true strength isn't found in brute force but in kindness, empathy, and a genuine desire to alleviate suffering. Doesn't that challenge the way we often think about strength and power? In many ways, her approach mirrors the Buddhist teachings of karuna, compassion, and metta, loving kindness. Although Ebadi comes from an Islamic background, the values she upholds are universal. Like a bodhisattva in Mahayana Buddhism, who vows to alleviate the suffering of all beings. Ebadi's life is dedicated to easing the pain of others, regardless of their nationality, religion, or status. Islamic and Buddhist parallels, compassion across traditions. While Ebadi is a practicing Muslim, it's fascinating to see how her work aligns with the teachings of Buddhism, particularly in its emphasis on compassion and kindness. Isn't it amazing how two very different religious traditions can share such common values? In Buddhism, karuna, compassion, is considered one of the four sublime states of mind, known as the Brahmaviharas. It is not merely about feeling sorry for someone but about actively engaging in the alleviation of their suffering. Similarly, in Islam, the concept of rahmah, mercy and compassion, is central to the faith. Both religions teach that compassion is an active, powerful force, one that compels us to take action in the face of injustice. Shirin Ebadi's legal work exemplifies this principle. She didn't just feel sorry for the victims of human rights abuses in Iran, she actively took on their cases, often at great personal risk. Her compassion wasn't passive, it was a driving force for change. In this way, she embodies the same spirit of karuna that is celebrated in Buddhism, but it's not just compassion that ties Ebadi's work to Buddhist teachings, it's also her commitment to metta, loving kindness. In Buddhism, metta is the practice of extending unconditional goodwill and kindness to all beings, even those who may be considered enemies. This echoes Ebadi's belief that even in the face of hostility, kindness and dialogue are the only ways to bring about lasting change. Isn't that such a refreshing perspective in today's world, where conflict so often seems to be met with more conflict? Compassion and kindness as strategic tools. Ebadi's belief in compassion and kindness isn't just an ethical stance, it's a strategic one. In her view, violence only perpetuates more violence, while compassion and kindness have the power to break the cycle of hatred and division. Her advocacy for nonviolent resistance mirrors the teachings of both Gandhi and Buddhist philosophy, where compassion is seen as a tool for transformation. Not just an ethical ideal. Think about the power of this approach for a moment. In a society where human rights defenders are often met with violence and hostility, responding with kindness requires immense strength. It's easy to react with anger when we are threatened, but Ebadi's life shows us that true courage lies in choosing compassion, even when it's the hardest option. Isn't that something we could all learn from? One of the most striking examples of this can be seen in Ebadi's relationship with the Iranian government. Despite the government's repeated attempts to silence her, through harassment, exile, and the arrest of her colleagues, Ebadi has never responded with hatred or calls for violence. Instead, she has consistently sought peaceful solutions, using legal means and dialogue to challenge the regime. This approach, while difficult, has allowed her to maintain the moral high ground and continue her work for justice, the global fight for human rights, a universal struggle. While much of Ebadi's work is centered on Iran, her message resonates far beyond the borders of her home country. Her commitment to human rights, particularly for women, children, and refugees, is part of a global struggle for dignity and justice. In every corner of the world, there are people fighting for their rights, often in the face of overwhelming opposition. Doesn't it give you hope to know that there are people like Shirin Ebadi out there, standing up for the voiceless? What's so inspiring about Ebadi's story is that it reminds us that the fight for human rights is universal. Whether it's the plight of women in Iran, the struggle for racial justice in the United States, or the fight for democracy in Myanmar, the principles that guide these movements, compassion, justice, and equality, are the same. Ebadi's life shows us that no matter where we are, or what our background is, we all have the ability to contribute to the fight for human rights. Whether through legal advocacy, activism, or simply by choosing to live with compassion and kindness, we can all make a difference. Isn't that an empowering thought? The personal sacrifices, risking everything for justice. When you look at a figure like Shirin Ebadi, it's easy to focus on her public achievements, the Nobel Prize, the groundbreaking legal work, her advocacy for human rights. But behind every victory is a personal story of sacrifice, of things lost, relationships strained, and a life forever altered by the commitment to justice. Imagine the emotional toll that fighting against an oppressive regime can take. Day after day, knowing that your work might put not only your own life but also the lives of your family members in danger. Yet, Ebadi pressed on. Why? Because her sense of moral duty outweighed her fear. One of the most significant sacrifices Ebadi had to endure was her forced exile from Iran. In 2009, as protests over the controversial presidential election shook the country, the Iranian government targeted Ebadi as a major threat. Her office was ransacked, her colleagues were imprisoned, and her family was harassed. And in an attempt to completely cut off her influence, the government seized her Nobel Peace Prize medal, an extraordinary and petty act that highlighted just how much of a threat they perceived her to be. Can you imagine having one of your life's greatest accomplishments stripped away as a punishment for standing up for what's right? Ultimately, Ebadi had to leave her home and take refuge in the UK. Her exile, like so many others before her, came with a deep sense of loss. She was separated from her roots, her culture, and her physical connection to the people she was fighting for. However, even exile couldn't stop her. It only gave her more visibility on the world stage, and she continued to fight from afar. Her perseverance, despite these personal hardships, stands as a testament to the strength of her conviction. Wouldn't you agree that this kind of endurance in the face of adversity is truly remarkable? Women and children's rights, a lifelong commitment. One of the central pillars of Shirin Ebadi's work has always been the fight for women and children's rights, particularly within the context of Iran's heavily patriarchal legal system. In Iran, under the strict interpretation of Sharia law, women face systemic discrimination, especially in matters of divorce, child custody, inheritance, and even the right to work. But Ebadi saw these injustices and refused to remain silent. She knew that true equality could only be achieved when these deep-seated inequalities were challenged head-on. Take, for instance, her work on the custody rights of women in Iran. Under Iranian law, women were not granted equal custody rights to men. Even in cases where the mother was the primary caretaker and the father was deemed unfit, the law often still favored the father. Ebadi tackled this issue in the courtroom, advocating fiercely for mothers who were losing their children to unjust legal rulings. Can you imagine the heartbreak of these women, losing their children simply because of their gender? Ebadi wasn't just fighting for legal victories, she was fighting to keep families together. Another critical area of her advocacy was centered around child marriage. In Iran, girls as young as 13 can legally marry with the permission of their father or guardian. Ebadi's work challenged this practice, emphasizing the profound emotional and physical toll it takes on young girls. She highlighted how child marriage robbed these children of their education, their freedom, and their futures. Her legal work pushed for raising the minimum age of marriage, not just in Iran but across many Middle Eastern countries where similar laws were in place. Isn't it staggering to think that in the 21st century, such injustices still exist? But thanks to the tireless work of advocates like Ebadi, the world is starting to pay attention. Ebadi and the global women's rights movement, Shirin Ebadi's influence has gone far beyond the borders of Iran. Her work has resonated across the world, especially within the broader context of the global women's rights movement. In the early 2000s, as globalization brought about a new era of interconnectedness, the struggles of women in one part of the world began to echo more loudly in other regions. What makes Ebadi's work particularly powerful is how she has served as a bridge between these movements. Consider the #MeToo movement, which took off in the West in 2017. While it focused primarily on sexual harassment and assault, its resonance was felt globally. In Iran, similar issues of gender-based violence had been part of Ebadi's advocacy for decades. The fact that her work on women's rights preceded this global conversation by so many years underscores how deeply entrenched these issues are and how universal they have become. Don't you think it's incredible how movements like #MeToo build on the foundation laid by activists like Ebadi? Moreover, Ebadi has worked with international organizations, including the United Nations, to spotlight the plight of women in countries where their rights are most severely restricted. She has made the case, time and time again, that women's rights are human rights, an assertion that should be self-evident but is often ignored in male-dominated political systems. Her voice has been crucial in shaping policies and encouraging reforms that aim to improve the lives of women globally. The intersection of human rights and religion. Another fascinating aspect of Shirin Ebadi's life is the way she navigates the often complicated intersection of human rights and religion. Iran, as an Islamic republic, enforces a strict interpretation of Sharia law. This legal framework is often used to justify the oppression of women, political dissidents, and religious minorities. However, Ebadi, as a devout Muslim herself, has always argued that Islam, when interpreted through a lens of compassion and justice, supports human rights. She has consistently highlighted the fact that the Quran speaks of justice, mercy, and the inherent dignity of every human being. In her view, it is not Islam itself that is oppressive but the way in which certain regimes interpret it for their own purposes. Isn't that a powerful point? So often, religion is used to justify violence or oppression. But Ebadi's interpretation is a reminder that faith, when practiced with compassion, can be a force for liberation, not control. This brings us back to the theme of compassion as a guiding principle in both religious and secular frameworks. Ebadi's interpretation of Islam aligns closely with the principles of karuna, compassion, and metta, loving kindness, in Buddhism. Both traditions, though distinct in their practices and beliefs, emphasize the importance of alleviating the suffering of others. For Ebadi, the Quran's call for mercy mirrors the Buddhist belief in compassion as an active force in the world. Isn't it fascinating to see how different belief systems can converge on the same ethical principles? Ebadi's call for nonviolent resistance, lessons from history. Shirin Ebadi's commitment to nonviolence is another key aspect of her work that deserves deeper exploration. In many ways, her philosophy mirrors that of Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., and Nelson Mandela, all of whom believed that true, lasting change could only be achieved through peaceful means. But Ebadi's commitment to nonviolent resistance is particularly striking given the context of her activism. Iran, under the rule of the Islamic Republic, has often responded to dissent with violence. Protesters are met with brutal crackdowns, and political dissidents are imprisoned, tortured, or even executed. In such a repressive environment, it might seem reasonable to assume that violence is the only way to fight back. But Ebadi has always rejected this notion. She believes that violence only perpetuates more violence, creating a cycle of hatred and retribution that is almost impossible to break. Instead, Ebadi calls for peaceful protest and legal challenges as the most effective tools for change. This philosophy is rooted in her deep belief in the power of law to create a more just society. For Ebadi, the legal system, even in its most flawed state, is a framework that can be used to hold regimes accountable. Isn't that a hopeful idea? That even in the face of overwhelming oppression, there are still peaceful avenues through which change can be achieved. Ebadi's call for nonviolent resistance is also deeply personal. She has experienced violence firsthand, through the harassment of her colleagues, the targeting of her family, and the threats to her own life. Yet, despite all of this, she remains committed to the idea that violence is never the answer. Her life is a testament to the power of peaceful resistance, even in the most trying circumstances. Can you imagine maintaining such a strong belief in nonviolence when you've faced so much violence yourself? Compassion in the face of oppression, parallels with Buddhist teachings. We've already touched on how Ebadi's work parallels certain Buddhist principles, but let's dive deeper into how karuna, compassion, and metta, loving kindness, play out in her activism. In Buddhism, karuna is seen as an active force that compels individuals to work toward alleviating the suffering of others. It's not enough to simply feel compassion, one must act on it. Ebadi's entire career has been built on this idea. She didn't just feel sorry for the women and children suffering under Iran's legal system, she took action. And she didn't stop at taking on individual cases, she worked to change the laws themselves. Her compassion was never passive, it was always a catalyst for change. Doesn't that resonate deeply with Buddhist ethics? Similarly, metta, or loving kindness, is about extending goodwill to all beings, even those who might oppose us. This principle can be seen in Ebadi's refusal to respond to violence with violence. Even when her opponents, such as the Iranian government, have treated her with cruelty, she has never called for revenge or hatred. Instead, she continues to advocate for peaceful dialogue and reform. This echoes the Buddhist belief that hatred cannot be conquered by more hatred, but only by love and understanding. The parallels between Ebadi's work and Buddhist teachings remind us that the fight for human rights is not just about legal victories, it's about changing hearts and minds. It's about creating a more compassionate world where everyone's dignity is respected. Isn't that the ultimate goal of any human rights movement? Global impact, Shirin Ebadi's legacy. As we look at Shirin Ebadi's life, it's clear that her influence extends far beyond the borders of Iran. Her work has resonated with activists, lawyers, and human rights defenders all over the world. Through her speeches, writings, and legal advocacy, she has inspired a new generation of activists to continue the fight for justice, equality, and human dignity. One of the most remarkable aspects of Ebadi's legacy is how she has managed to maintain her relevance even after being forced into exile. Many activists, once removed from their home countries, lose their platform or their influence. But Ebadi's voice has only grown stronger. Through her work with international organizations, her advocacy at the United Nations, and her tireless writing, she has kept the spotlight on the struggles of the Iranian people. Moreover, her commitment to nonviolence and compassion has had a profound impact on the global human rights community. In a world where political dissent is often met with force, Ebadi's insistence on peaceful resistance offers a much-needed alternative. Her life serves as a reminder that compassion is not a sign of weakness, it is a powerful tool for change. Wouldn't you agree that the world needs more leaders like Ebadi, who lead with their hearts as much as their minds?